Good evening. I'm a college instructor, and I'm going to tell you a story. This past summer, I taught a seminar in the Summer Bridge Scholars Program here at the University of Michigan. The program is designed to bridge the gaps and opportunities created by systemic inequities in education. And the class is themed around socially relevant and intellectually exciting themes. My class theme centered on the concept of freedom in American cultures, its varying definitions across political lines as it's allocated to different marginalized groups. And during one class session, we discussed freedom in the context of educational access. When we talked about this, a young woman raised her hand and proceeded to share her experience with her own educational background. Interestingly, she described her experience, the lack of resources, the gaps in opportunities, the lack of funding with the term miseducation. And I was struck. In all of my years of teaching in higher ed, I had never heard that term before, at least and not in this context. And yet, I saw parts of myself in her when she was talking, because I remember feeling the same way when I started my own university journey. As brilliant as she was apprehensive about starting at one of the top public universities in the country, even though she got accepted. And she's not alone in feeling this way. I talk to countless students who feel like they're not good enough. They question how they got in. They worry if their educational background has prepared them enough. They wonder if they'll make it to graduation. They suffer from what we commonly call imposter syndrome. And while I think adjustment is definitely part of the problem, I also think there's a deeper issue at hand. And it's one that points to systemic inequities in our education system. But on a more profound level, I believe that it points towards systemic inequalities that impact us all every day. So contrary to what you might be expecting, I'm not here to talk to you about representations of Muslim women or the politics of hijab in American culture. I'll save that for another TED Talk. I might get really good at this. Instead, I'm here today just as somebody interested in societal relations, how they impact us, how these dynamics shape our lived experiences, and importantly, how an understanding of these dynamics can inform our approach to teaching in higher education, and how teaching itself can be a tool in solving the problem of miseducation. So I want you guys to take a moment and visualize with me. I want you to think of your current or prospective degrees, your current or prospective careers. I want you to think about your interests, your passions, your hobbies. Think about your dreams. Then I want you guys to think about your educational training, your childhood upbringing, the things that make you who you are. Then imagine all of you in this room came into a classroom to learn the craft of research and writing with me. That sounds a little overwhelming, doesn't it? None of us are the same. At the start of every class in higher education, regardless of the level or the subject, are people like you that enter from all walks of life. But when we teach in uniform ways, when we don't account for this richness and diversity, we are perpetuating the disadvantages of miseducation. I teach writing and academic inquiry here at the University of Michigan. And in such courses, accounting for the impact of miseducation is more important than ever. Building a student's confidence is directly tied to their ability to express themselves in the settings that matter to them. But many students that I talk to express deep disdain towards writing in professional context, or they believe they can completely avoid it through the pursuit of a STEM degree. Most troubling of all is that not everybody finds the insurmountable joy in writing an academic research essay. I'm just kidding. It's not my favorite pastime either. But I know from firsthand experience how important it is to be able to express yourself. I know what's at stake when my visibility as a Muslim woman is dependent on a packaging that's deemed acceptable to national interests. Or I felt the frustrations when voices in popular media speak on my behalf, or take one representative story as a representation of our collective whole. How then do we develop courses that account for your wide range of life experiences, interests, and identities? The short answer is through an instructional approach that centers on the principles of anti-racist, inclusive, and accessible education. The long answer will unfold through the rest of this TED Talk. I want to emphasize that anti-racist, inclusive, and accessible education is student-centered, with the goal that students will understand the world that they live in. So when I say anti-racism, it's not just about representing specific groups of people, but it's about interrogating the relationship between race and other social identities that impact us all, and other salient social identities that impact us all. An inclusive classroom space accounts for all students. If we resolve to build the inequalities, or to bridge the inequalities, we must understand the relationship between labor, race, and solidarity in order to level an intellectual space where all perspectives are valued and the exchange of ideas is paramount. Accessible education ensures that every student has access. If we ensure that the student with the most obstacles has to overcome the one that has to overcome the most hurdles has access, then we have successfully ensured that all of our students have access. In essence, and invariably, what I'm trying to say is that we're all interconnected. Herein then, I offer you 3 tenets by which we can develop a classroom space that is reflective of these values. Number 1, respect your students as intellectuals. What I mean by this is that the unset expectation in higher education is that the professor is the producer of knowledge and the student is a passive recipient. What would happen if we entered the classroom space where we were co-collaborators in the production of knowledge? This approach asks us to dismantle the hierarchical structure between the professor-student relationship. Every semester, I tell students that I am the student. They are going to teach me what they want for me to know about their areas of interest. I'm just there to facilitate the process of research and show them the conventions of the writing genre. Through this approach, students then become inspired and excited to share the knowledge that they're so good at and that they know really well. A student, for example, will take on his own side hustle and sneaker resale. He will examine the ethics of his resale markup practices, and then he'll argue and realize in real life that he needs to lower his prices. Number 2, build students' confidence by amplifying their voices and encouraging them to ask questions. When students feel seen and heard, they will take on topics in new and innovative ways. I talked earlier about the importance of being able to tell your own story. Sometimes we take a text as representative of our particular group, but not everybody that shares your identity shares your politics. Capitalism impacts us all. Through this approach, then, in our class, in a research and writing class, we read texts that interrogate the social conditions within which an author is responding to, while we simultaneously build our reading, writing, critical thinking, response skills. An awareness of the world and a development of our skills happen simultaneously. The next part is to get students to trust the process of genuine inquiry by showing them that there are different kinds of questions and no question is off limits. So there are questions that produce fact-based knowledge, and then there are those that will lead them down a path of multiple perspectives, of which they need to interrogate, come up with their own arguments, and substantiate them and their own evidence. So through this approach, a student is frustrated by the antics, by the predatory antics of big car dealership body shops towards his immigrant father's small local business mechanic shop. He will first compare and contrast business models of both, and then he will argue that not only should we all opt for small business mechanic shops for our car repairs because of the unmatched personal experience, but because these mechanic shops are at the fabric of the American cultural experience. He argues that small mechanic shops not only contribute to the American cultural experience in tangible ways, but that by investing in them, we are protecting potentially disadvantaged. We are protecting the potentially disadvantaged. Finally, number 3, teach the whole student by accounting for their overall well-being. Teaching in the humanities, and I think teaching in general, necessarily requires us to invoke the most human parts of ourselves. A person's intellectual capacity is only one slice of who they are. How do we expect them to throw all other parts of themselves out the window once they enter our classroom space? You can challenge your student. You can provide a classroom with structure and rigor, but still be flexible. Life happens, and that's okay. Through this approach, for example, all you have to do is be compassionate. Ask your students, how are you? This is actually a true story. In one student's final reflection, where I asked students to assess their growth in terms of the course learning outcome, a student wrote that when I asked her this question, I saved her life. I'm not kidding. I was speechless. When I told my family the story, I almost sobbed. On the one hand, I had no idea that this casual office hours conversation with her had had such an impact, and on the other, I had no idea that she was struggling until the end of the term. I thought that I was doing what normal people do. We're humans. We ask about each other. How are you? How are you all? In line with a good, solid research argument, I tell students that the best way to add complexity and depth in their essays is to address the skeptic, a naysayer, if you will. So I will be consistent, and I will do the same here. The skeptic in me asks, am I overreaching with my calls for anti-racist, inclusive, and accessible education? Can we really solve the disadvantages or the problems of miseducation through these 3 tenets? I'm not saying that every single student will walk out of your class with this renewed sense of hope that's going to change the world. But what I am saying is that students will reach their greatest potential when they feel seen and when their voices are heard, when you achieve a delicate balance of fostering their individual interests and cultivating a space that encourages the exchange of ideas. To that end, if I can string the commonalities of these 3 tenets together, it's that who a student is part and parcel to your curriculum and should be embedded in every single one of your lesson plans. Simply put, if we want to solve the problems of miseducation, we have to know where a student has come from. We have to meet them where they are in order to help them get to where they want to go. Finally, I can't believe I get to say this in real life, not as a joke to my friends, not after some spiel in front of my classroom about good writing, but thank you all for coming and listening to my TED Talk.